Good day. As I've discussed in my previous videos, we are in a quiet before the storm situation in terms of the Ukrainian conflict. The various battle fronts seem to be largely stable. Ukraine continues to try and launch attacks in various directions, but so far it's failing to make any progress with respect to them at all. There is one exception where Ukraine continues to make a major effort, and that is against this town of Krasny Liman and this area in northern Donetsk, which I'm going to discuss shortly. But everywhere else, things, Zaporozhye region, Kherson region, I won't say things are quiet. Fighting continues there all the time. The information suggests, by the way, that Ukraine is suffering heavy losses, and I'm going to come to that shortly. But there doesn't seem to be any indication of any imminent breakthroughs or changes of position. The only area, as I've said, is northern Donetsk, where the Ukrainians seem to be continuing this effort to capture the town of Krasny Liman. Now, I said previously that this is the quiet before the storm. We have confirmation from the Kremlin, from Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, that as soon as the 4 regions that are now voting to join Russia are admitted into the Russian Federation, the legal position of the special military operation changes immediately, and the constitution of the Russian Federation comes into effect. There's been some suggestions that this is how things might start to shape out. In the event that all 4 regions vote to join Russia, which is a certainty, Putin will, the Duma and the Federal Assembly will pass the relevant laws. Putin will probably confirm his agreement to those laws on the 30th of September, when it's widely believed that he's going to address the Russian Parliament, the Federal Assembly. And then forces of the Russian regular army will start to enter these regions in large numbers. And let me stress again, these are probably already existing forces which have been earmarked for this purpose. They're probably not going to be drawn from these reservists that are being called up at the moment. Now, if you remember, some weeks ago, there were all kinds of rumors about major Russian build-ups, about large tank forces being assembled near Kharkiv region on the Russian side of the border, large deployments in Crimea, lots of military activity, and we didn't hear much more about that. And since these were all rumors, we've no way of knowing clearly whether or not that is true or not. But I'm going to make a suggestion, which is that if those rumors are true, then those major troop movements that we were hearing about were initiated even as the plans to call these referendums and perhaps to announce this mobilization, this partial mobilization, were being debated and discussed before the final decision was made to push forward with this idea in the aftermath of Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive and after the discussions, the negotiations which took place in Samarkand. So I suspect that those forces probably are there, and they probably will be moved into Donbass and these other regions, exactly as these suggestions, which I'm seeing floating around the Russian media, are suggesting. Then there will probably be some form of ultimatum, some sort of demand to Ukraine to pull its forces out of these regions, out of Donbass, out of Zaporozhye. I will be interested to see whether that includes Zaporozhye city, but I suspect that it will. And then, when Ukraine rejects that demand or ultimatum as it must do, then we will start to see a much more extensive, much more powerful Russian military campaign being initiated, which will probably continue for several weeks and months, but which will really gain traction and momentum after the autumn rains and the hardening of the roads and the fields following the winter frosts. Now, Gilbert Doctorow, one of the most astute observers of Russian affairs, and somebody who is, by the way, based in Russia itself, has recently written a blog piece in which he says that the word which is circulating is in Russia is that the Kremlin aims to have this war completed by the 31st of December. Well, we've seen many dates floating around. I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know whether that's possible or not. I suspect to some extent it depends on what the West does in response to all these moves. At the moment, by the way, the West isn't doing very much of anything. But regardless, we will see. But if you remember, in one of my videos, I think it was the one I did yesterday, I did say that perhaps, possibly, the Russians would be looking to have some sort of decisive outcome in Ukraine by midwinter, and that would correlate reasonably well with this 31st of December date. However, let me repeat again, a warning that I've made before: the greatest mistake an analyst or commentator can make, the easiest trap an analyst or commentator can make, is to assume that because a rumour corresponds with his own beliefs, that rumour must be true. I don't know that, in fact, there is a plan to wrap this all up by winter or by the 31st of December. I'm just reporting what Doctorow is saying. Anyway, that now brings me to the one area where really intense fighting is going on, and not just intense fighting, because there's also intense fighting going on in Kherson region, which I'm going to come to in a moment, but where Ukraine continues to try to make efforts to break through, and that is towards this town of Krasny Liman and certain surrounding villages, of which the most important seems to be a place called Yampol. I'm not a military strategist, tactician, expert, ex-soldier, ex-military officer, ex-military anything. So take what I'm going to say now with a heavy pinch of salt. My impression, as I discussed in my video yesterday, is that this attempt to capture Krasny Liman may have had grander objectives previously, but has now become for the Ukrainian leadership an obsession, an end in itself, and they are throwing more and more lives away trying to achieve it. There was apparently more fighting yesterday, and the information that's trickling in, and which again I cannot confirm, but which I think is highly likely, is that Russian reinforcements have been arriving from Russia itself in the area around Krasny Liman, and that the Ukrainian offensives or attacks, such as they are, manage sometimes briefly to gain some ground. They then become the target of massive Russian artillery shelling. The Ukrainian forces then suffer very heavy losses, and generally by the end of the day they are thrown back. In other words, it is beginning to take something of the form of the meat grinder that we've been seeing happening in Kherson region. By the way, I detest the expression meat grinder. I find it enormously callous in its sound. I'm going to use it because there's a limited amount of time in these videos, even my videos, and I don't want to spend more time trying to explain what is going on. Suffice to say, Ukraine is throwing away lives, reinforcing failure. It is doing so in Kherson region, and it is doing so, or so it seems to me, it is starting to do so, or in danger of starting to do so, in Krasny Liman. It is throwing away lives and machines and probably senior personnel as well in attacks which, even if they eventually do succeed in capturing Krasny Liman, which perhaps, just possibly, is starting to look less likely. Even if they do manage to capture Krasny Liman, are not going to achieve the kind of strategic objectives that Ukraine set itself when it launched that offensive against Krasny Liman in the first place. Briefly, Russian forces now are too strong in this area to allow any strategic development of this battle, or at least so it seems to my inexpert eyes. And besides, there's now growing acknowledgement that the autumn rains are going to make further advances by Ukrainian forces ill-equipped to deal with the muddy conditions that the terrain and climate will impose. It's going to make that extremely difficult to maintain an offensive in that sort of way. Now, I've discussed the parallels between the fighting in and around Krasny Liman and the fighting which is still going on around Kherson region. And there's been a long article about the fighting in Kherson region in the New York Times. It's very long. I have to say, if Americans will forgive me saying so, articles in the American media tend to be inordinately long and often circular and repetitious, at least in my opinion. And I'm not going to read it all for that, partly for that reason, but also, of course, because it's behind a paywall. But I will read some extracts from it, and it gives a sense of what's been going on in Kherson region, which tallies exactly with what Alex Christoforou and I have been saying on the Duran, what I've been saying on this channel, what others have been saying, what has been reported in both Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels, that Ukraine's Kherson offensive has made little to no substantive progress, that Ukraine is suffering massive, heavy casualties, we'll come to that shortly, and that this exercise, this offensive, which had been so talked up, has all the appearances of a failure. Anyway, the title of the article reads, "In Ukraine's south, fierce fighting and deadly cost." The offensive in the south was the most highly anticipated military action of the summer. Ukraine is making gains. I should say the article doesn't tell us where Ukraine is making those gains. Over the last few weeks, it's made none. Ukraine is making gains, but the fighting is grinding, grueling, and steep in casualties. And then the article goes on to say, Ukraine's southern offensive was the most highly anticipated military action of the summer. Forecast by Ukrainian officials for weeks, its goal was to push the Russians back from a strategic region along the coast, bolster the confidence of a battered citizenry, and prove to allies that Ukraine could make a good use of Western-supplied weapons. And then the article goes on to say, but overall, the south remains a different story from the northeast. The northeast is Kharkiv. Interviews with dozens of commanders, ordinary soldiers, medics, village leaders and civilians who recently escaped the conflict zone. Interesting expression, interesting word use, escaped the conflict zone. portray a more difficult and costly campaign. The fighting is grinding, grueling, and steep in casualties, perhaps the most heartbreaking battle in Ukraine right now. And the article then goes on to say, Russian forces are deeply dug in here, and this weekend the Kremlin is trying to cement its gains by holding highly contentious referendums in occupied areas to annex them. Ukrainian officials say they have little choice but to attack. I'm going to push back on that in a moment. They are racing to recapture territory before the October rains turn the roads here into impassable sludge. That's, by the way, the first admission I've seen in any part of the Western media that the autumn rains are going to bring Ukraine's offensives to a stop. And then it goes on to say, the article goes on to say, and they need to keep showing the world, especially before a nasty winter sets in and tests their allies' resolve, that they can push the Russians out. The Ukrainian government does not usually disclose casualty figures, but the soldiers and commanders interviewed in the past week portrayed the battlefield losses as high, inverted commas, and massive, and that's in quotation marks. They described large offensives in which columns of Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles tried to cross open fields only to be pounded mercilessly by Russian artillery and blown up by Russian mines. One Ukrainian soldier, speaking anonymously, because he was not authorized to publicly discuss casualties, said that during a recent assault we lost 50 guys in 2 hours. In another place, said the soldier who works closely with different frontline units, hundreds of Ukrainian troops were killed or wounded while trying to take a single village which is still in Russian hands. The article goes on to say that the Russians have built formidable defences, trenches zigzagging along irrigation canals, fortified bunkers, pillboxes, foxholes, even tank trenches carved out of the earth by bulldozers and covered with concrete slabs that enable the Russians to blast shells from positions that are very difficult for Ukraine to hit. Anyway, there's much more about this. There's much more in this article. One particular point that's made, one Ukrainian soldier says the problem is that we are advancing with no artillery preparation, without suppressing their firing positions. We don't have ammunition, and the result is that Ukraine's army are suffering great losses. All these heroic attacks are made with so much blood. And then the article goes on to say in another place that Ukrainian soldiers who are brought back wounded from the battle almost never show that they have, they're almost never wounded from small arms fire. Almost entirely they seem to have been wounded by artillery and missile strikes and things of that kind, which begs the question, by the way, given that Russia has such enormous artillery preponderance and there's very little hand-to-hand fighting, how many losses are the Russians suffering? Probably not many. Now, this is a meat grinder which is being described. It reminds me, I have to say, of the claims that have been made, that I used to hear being made by British soldiers in their late in life, when I was here in Britain in the 60s and 70s. Quite a few of them were still alive then. about the fighting in the First World War, about the Somme, and about Passchendaele. Now, I know that there's been a great deal of historical revision and reanalysis of those battles. There's now views amongst British academia, amongst British historians, that British generals like General Haig, who have been often fiercely criticised for their conduct of the First World War, that General Haig and the other British generals actually knew what they were doing, and that the battles, these attrition battles, were not as ill-conceived and ill-structured as popular belief in Britain still holds. I haven't read these histories. I'm not very familiar with the history of the First World War. Perhaps much of what I've heard about the fighting in the Somme and in Passchendaele needs to be looked at again, and maybe is not fully accurate. I don't know. What I will say is that this kind of fighting in Kherson region, to me, looks disastrously like the popular image in Britain of the fighting in Passchendaele and the Somme during the First World War. Columns of Ukrainian tanks and troops sent into battle in Kherson region only to be annihilated by the Russian artillery. And I get the sense that we're now very close to seeing the same thing starting to happen around Krasny Liman. The fighting there is a bit more fluid. There seem to be fewer troops on either side involved. The artillery densities are not as great. So perhaps we're at a relatively early stage in what is a progressing battle, but it's losing the quality of an encounter battle, of a rapid offensive by the Ukrainians, colliding with Russian columns and Russian defenders, advancing in some places, being pushed back in others, and then maneuvering for a new attack in somewhere else. It's starting to acquire instead, or so it seems to me, something of that same static quality that we see in Kherson region, where Ukrainian troops are being sent, given orders to advance, and are being killed in horrendous numbers by Russian artillery and by Russian airstrikes. Now, I've said many times, I just don't understand the logic of this. If we go back to that New York Times article, you will see that there's some explanation that this is all about conducting these offences in order to bolster the confidence of a battered citizenry and prove to allies that Ukraine can make good use of Western supplied weapons. Is that really a price? Is this really a price worth paying to achieve those kind of objectives? To, in other words, conduct an offensive for optics? Now, I fully understand that if one carries out an offensive for optics in a place like Kharkiv region, which is thinly defended and where a rapid advance was possible. Perhaps that offensive had little in strategic significance, but as I said, the psychological effect of the Ukrainian army advancing, defeating the Russians or regaining territory, well, that was considerable. Apparently, Ukraine suffered very heavy casualties as a result of that offensive, when Ukrainian troops who were advancing were caught in the open and were subjected to withering Russian artillery and air attacks. But nonetheless, you can say that something was achieved. In Kherson, perhaps in Krasny Liman, banging against a wall and capturing perhaps the odd village at the costs of hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. And notice the Ukrainian soldier who said that one of his units, one unit he was connected to, lost 50 men in 2 hours. How does that make any kind of military sense? Now, it's important to say that when we're talking about soldiers, we're talking about human beings, we're talking about people with lives, with thoughts, with hopes, with fears, with families, with connections, with friends. You're going to throw all of these people into this kind of slaughter in that kind of way, day after day, in order to bolster the confidence of a battered citizenry and prove to allies that Ukraine can make good use of Western supplied weapons. You're going to keep on doing this and accelerate doing this because you are in a race against the October rains, which are just a couple of weeks away now at most, making it almost inconceivable that any offensive that you're going to launch or planning to launch can hope to achieve whatever strategic objectives you might originally have had. I mean, this all seems to me terrible. Now, apparently, there's again been, or at least there are rumours that there's again been, another argument between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny in Kiev. There's reports, and these reports always, I should stress, originate from Ukrainian sources, that Zelensky is becoming increasingly frustrated and angry that his offensives are not making progress, and that he's been rowing with Zaluzhny and the other members of the Ukraine command, trying to get them to increase efforts to gain some ground. Any ground, apparently, anywhere, just even if it's just the odd village, just to show that Ukraine is still on the attack. Well, if there is any truth to this, to these reports, then all I can say is that they merely prove that Zelensky is a totally inadequate and wrong person to be leading Ukraine in this great hour of trial. Before I finish wrapping up with the military matters, I should just make one further additional point about the state of things, which is that there are now some reports, very difficult to corroborate, and they may be very sketchy, that Russian forces are now starting to build up significantly along the Oskol River line, and that there are even instances where the Russians are now taking the offensive, and that they've crossed the Oskol River and advanced west of the Oskol River. There's even some suggestions that there's been Russian forces operating in and around the western half of Kupiansk. This is that city divided by the Oskol River. The Russians pulled across, moved their troops across to the east bank of the Oskol River. They hold eastern Kupiansk. They abandoned western Kupiansk to the Ukrainians. But there's some suggestions that the Russians are now operating in western Kupiansk as well. Well, all of this is very sketchy. It may not even be true. But I would have thought, again, talking about this from a Ukrainian point of view and in my own inexpert way, that if throwing men and machines to try and capture Krasny Liman is a bad idea for many reasons. Doing so in a way that might be weakening Ukrainian defenses in precisely the area where Ukraine has only achieved its only success, which is in the Izium, Balaklia, Kupiansk area, allowing perhaps some sort of Russian counterattack to form there. Well, that would be utter folly. I'm not saying that such a Russian counterattack is on the cards. I don't know. But all I would say is that I'm finding it, again, increasingly difficult to understand what Ukrainian tactics are in this war. Regardless, let me go back again to what I said at the start of the program. One way or the other, the character of the war is going to change radically over the next few weeks, once the referendums are completed and the Russians formally incorporate these territories, these 4 regions, into Russia itself, and once the mobilization that is being conducted in Russia is completed, releasing, I suspect, more professional Russian military units to take the battle to Ukraine. On the point about that mobilization, you continue to get these very divergent accounts. Some speak of a well-oiled, flawlessly operating mobilization machine. Others a chaotic, disorganized mess. My inclination is that it's probably going reasonably well, given what a large and complex exercise that it is. And let me repeat again, the people who've been protesting against it, scattered protests which seem to be largely over, they're not the people who are being called up. They're people who are probably close to the military and who probably are pretty patriotic and willing to serve. Anyway, that's where we are on the military fronts. There's been no more news about any Saudi mediation exercise. I would reiterate again that if it exists, it's only a rumour. It does seem to me, by the way, I should make clear, I picked up this rumour from Ukrainian sources. It did seem to me that it's a plausible idea. One rumour that is fantastic and should be completely discounted, and which I'm not going to waste any time on, but which some of you may have seen, was stories that were circulating on the internet yesterday and the day before that there'd been some kind of a coup in Beijing. That is complete fantasy. I don't know who was behind it, but it was something that had no basis in fact. But what we can see, and what is becoming increasingly visible by the day, is the deepening economic crisis across the West. And it's now taken a particular extra dimension as a result of what the Federal Reserve Board in the United States is doing. Now, there are divergent views about the Fed's intentions. There is the conventional view that the Fed is raising interest rates because it wants to tamp down inflation in the United States, which is extremely high. There is the other view, expressed notably by my very good friend Tom Longo, but I see it shared by some others, that the Federal Reserve Board is essentially repatriating money and industry to the United States and is out to smash the euro. I'm not going to waste time debating these views. All I'm going to say is, regardless of what the intentions of the Federal Reserve Board are, and I still lean, by the way, to the inflation theory, The fact is that the steady tightening of monetary conditions in the United States is going to do two things. Firstly, it is inevitably going to create a recession in the United States. That is a given now. But the other thing it's going to do, which is in the short term at least much more serious, is that it is creating a exchange rate crisis amongst many economies. Now, a classic illustration of this is what's happening in Britain. Now, the British government, like every other government, at least every other Western government, is struggling with inflation problems caused by big spikes in energy and in food costs. So there's a supply chain side to the crisis. But another part of the cause of the crisis is the massive financial overhang from the huge spending that took place during the pandemic, which was worsened hugely by the reckless spending of the Biden administration in its first year of office. So this has created a worldwide inflation, which every government around the world, but especially Western governments, is trying to wrestle with. And the British government is trying to wrestle with it in a curious way. On the one hand, they're the Bank of England is raising interest rates to try to deal with Britain's internal inflation problem. But simultaneously, the British government is trying to spend money and cut taxes in order to stimulate the British economy and to increase growth. And I suspect, by the way, it's not going to be alone in this. I suspect you're going to start to see more and more governments, especially in Europe, following the same course over the next few months. The problem they have is that with the Fed tightening, all that is doing is that it is putting massive pressure on currencies like those of Britain and before long the EU, the euro, which are pursuing looser policies, both monetary and fiscal, than the US. So we see the dollar surging and we see sterling crashing. As I make this video, it is almost at parity with the dollar. And I know that there are some people who think that before long, for the first time in its long history, sterling will fall below parity with the dollar. And the euro also, of course, is under severe pressure. And perhaps it's important to say here that there's been much talk about the decline in oil prices over the last few weeks. But it's important to say that oil prices have fallen in terms of their dollar price. But of course, if the dollar is becoming more expensive relative to the euro and sterling, then countries that have to pay for oil in dollars, but whose own currencies are not dollar denominated, are going to find that oil every bit as expensive probably as they did before. That's quite apart from the fact that practically everybody expects that within the next few weeks, the oil price, the headline oil price, the dollar oil price is going to start rising again. So we can see a major downward spiral. It's questionable, in my opinion, how long the British government can continue on its current course, given the pressures on the exchange rate. Either interest rates are going to have to be increased far more, in which case whatever attempt the British government is making to increase growth rates through this extra spending and these tax cuts is going to come to nothing. Either interest rates are going to have to rise in Britain, or the government is going to have to pull back on some of this extra spending and perhaps reverse some of these tax cuts, which would be, by the way, politically not just embarrassing, but would probably leave the Liz Truss Kwarteng government fatally wounded. But we could see how these crises is cranking up at almost every point and every level. And one of the curiosities about this is if you go to the financial and economics pages and to follow discussions by Western leaders, they tend to avoid the elephant in the room, which is that part of the reason for this crisis, in fact not part of the reason, the main part of this reason, is this economic war they themselves decided to launch against Russia back in February. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, one of the few people who, it seems to me, has kept his grasp on reality, has now come out and said that, in his opinion, the anti-Russian sanctions need to be lifted by the end of this year. I've seen reports that there are others who are saying this as well. Apparently, Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis is also becoming concerned about the effect the sanctions are having on the Greek economy. Well, I don't know what, if any, effect that will have on EU policymakers. I don't know what policy the new Italian government will follow in response to these events. But I'm going to say this. Over the next few weeks, we're going to start to see a major intensification of Russian military action in Ukraine. We've seen that Ukraine has not been able to defeat in Ukraine even a small part of the Russian army, perhaps 70 to 80,000 men in total, backed by this Donbass militia, the size of which I find difficult to get a clear figure for, but I'm going to guess around 100,000 men in total. So Ukraine hasn't been able to defeat that Russian force, which is perhaps best understood as a rather big expeditionary force. This despite all the weapons and supplies and machinery and intelligence and satellite data it's received from the West. It looks like it's going to face a huge Russian offensive by a much more powerful Russian force within the next few weeks or months. All the indications are that Ukraine's own economy is on the skids, with spending completely out of control and with tax revenue having collapsed. And we see deepening economic problems in the West, deepening recession, likely exchange rate problems which, by the way, might very soon, before long, start to cause disputes and arguments between the Europeans and the Americans. Surely the moment has now finally come, I say this so often, to draw the obvious conclusions. This isn't working. It's not working at any level. It's not working in military terms. It's not working in economic terms. Thousands of people in Ukraine are being killed every day, probably, sent to the slaughter, to capture the odd village. And of course, in Europe, and before long, no doubt in the United States as well, people are going to lose their jobs, businesses are going to close, economic hardship is going to increase, government budgets are going to come under increasing strain. Currencies like the euro and sterling are in severe trouble. Let me say that one currency is holding up remarkably well against the dollar, and that is the ruble. As of the time when I made this video, it was trading at 58 rubles to the dollar, as opposed to 74 rubles to the dollar at the start of this year when this crisis began. So the Russians look resilient. They look resilient economically. They have their diplomatic backs covered. Their Chinese and Indian friends are not abandoning them, nor are the Turks, by the way. And they're able to hold their own in Ukraine. And before long, they're likely to take the offensive in Ukraine. If there isn't a Saudi mediation plan out there, perhaps it's time that some Western leaders telephone Riyadh and perhaps Ankara and asked for one. They can't themselves bring themselves to call Putin, which I can understand. Well, there are intermediaries out there. There are intermediaries in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, perhaps in India, perhaps in other places. The time to do that is long overdue. We are at 1 minute past the hour. Let's not waste any more time as winter closes in, as Ukraine's prospects turn bleak, and as those of the European economy, and perhaps ultimately and eventually that of the United States itself, turn bleak also. Well, I've said all I'm going to say today in this program. I hope I've explained things clearly. I should quickly add that I haven't covered everything that's happening on the battlefields. There's more information from Bakhmut. It seems that more suburbs, more of its southern suburbs, have been captured or stormed by the Wagner group, but I don't have many details about that. But this is where I'm going to stop for today. So remember, you can find all my videos and Duran videos on our other platforms, first and foremost on Locals, where I do live streams every Wednesday, usually at 1900 hours, but that's been the times, 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. That's been the time I followed up to now, but I might be adjusting it shortly. But anyway, and of course, whether I do one this week will to some extent depend on my state of health, which is only precariously improving, by the way. But anyway, I will keep you all on Locals informed about that. But you can also find us on Rumble, on ODYSEE, on BitChute, and of course on Telegram. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Remember, you can go to our shop and buy our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all these other great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.